During the Legion announcement, lead designer Ian Hazzikostas stated Blizzard's intent to make dungeons more relevant throughout the timeline of Legion. Today I've got 10 ways to potentially do that, with some of them being about making it a more fun experience, and some also being about making them last for longer than a few weeks. First of all, having a weekly or daily quest which involves changing the actual dungeon itself. Now, it's often said that variety is the spice of life, and it's definitely true that after many months, dungeons get old. It's an unavoidable fact when you're doing the same thing, but what can be done is essentially to create variation where you can and provide an interesting reason to go back to something. I think that having a weekly or perhaps daily dungeon quest which changes the dungeon in a significant way would be an excellent way to do that. Hell, with Dalaran even being in this expansion, we could actually get the quest from the same guy who did the Wrath of the Lich King dungeon dailies, assuming he hasn't managed to get himself killed. Anyway, how would dungeons vary? Well, it depends on how much work Blizzard would want to do. The least interesting way is an arbitrary boost to the rewards. That's boring, let's not do that. A better example is to do essentially what they did with ICC and change up a trash portion of the raid to have maybe a mini-boss or some sort of new mechanic for you to overcome that would result in you getting maybe some new currency, maybe a chance at a loot roll for any of the bosses, or maybe a loot bag or something like that. Now you could go even further and open up a new area of the dungeon which contains a boss with, say, randomized mechanics from a pool, similar to how they do the Diablo bosses, albeit a pseudo-random pool so the fight is still fun and tailored to people. It could be taken even further. You could have mini-events where friendly characters spawn, and loads of different things. It's a design playground, but essentially my point is having something which shakes up the formula and gives you a reason to do the dungeon again for a bit more reward, but also in a different way. Another thing that I would love is winged dungeons with quest lines and a story that spans the wings. First of all, we all know how making winged dungeons is a great way to increase the expansion's quantity of dungeons while still allowing the artists to have functional wrists and not get all sad and tired. Now, of course, having winged dungeons means that you are progressing through a part of the world from dungeon to dungeon to dungeon. You're doing maybe two things in Ulduar, so you're going through Ulduar. Now, tying a story into that progression is hardly a new idea, but it is something that just hasn't been done in recent years. Now, while story content only lasts once, it can be both a good way to drive people into dungeons in the first place, because maybe that one-off story can have a bit of a cool reward because it is one-off, but also it's a great way to deliver an enjoyable bit of endgame storytelling. Hell, if Blizzard even managed to have a cinematic at the very end, then that would be really cool. Now, Blizzard often says their mantra is to deliver epic experiences. I think things like this would be an absolutely brilliant way to do that. For the next 2 points, I'm going to cover some reward-based things, and I'm going to start off with unique weapons. One thing that always strikes me when I look back at past dungeons is that many of them had some very cool and unique weapon rewards. Now open up your dungeon journal and take a look at the Burning Crusade dungeons. Now seriously, if you're into transmog, then there are some really cool weapons in those dungeons. With Warlords of Draenor though, we ended up with a great deal of shared loot tables and a ludicrous amount of different bits of gear sharing the exact same model. I think that just makes it all a little bit less interesting and a lot more normalized. I mean, hell, I still remember getting my Red Sword of Courage all the way back in Wrath of the Lich King. Now, Legion is going to have its artifact weapons, which are pretty much going to span the whole of the endgame, but they can just give you skins. Or perhaps they can just drop regular weapons that are essentially meant for transmog throughout these dungeons. I think a lot of that stuff would be very effective and just would make the rewards a little bit more interesting. Still in the theme of rewards, I think dungeon sets are another excellent addition that I would love to see come back to the game. These would be bits of armor with set bonuses that you could essentially work towards completing, because completing a set bonus is a pretty satisfying thing. If they were to come from a quest line, then, you know what, all the better, and it could even make for a sort of fun guiding hand into the initial gearing process of the expansion. Now if they were, like two of my past videos have suggested, to remove LFR in favour for making dungeons more extensive and more fun, then perhaps having something like a dungeon set to aim for would be a particularly excellent addition to the game. Next up, I would like to see more mounts and cosmetic items on a personal loot basis. Quite a few past dungeons actually dropped mounts. Now that personal loot is a thing, there are far fewer sort of social issues around just giving one mount to a group of 5 people, and I think it would be great if they would reintroduce these, rather than put them on the store. Moving on from that, I think more in the way of just interesting personal loot drops that aren't anything to do with gear would be great. I don't like having too much RNG for the actual gearing, but I think that RNG can be a great cherry on top for dungeon content because it can offer replayability incentives on the long term. If you keep on coming back, well, you'll be getting loads of rolls of a dice for various different interesting items. It could be mounts, it could be pets, it could be any of those things. Maybe they add class accessories into the game, maybe it could be other forms of currency, or just generally interesting things. There's a lot they can do there to just spice up that experience and add a cherry on top that doesn't affect the gearing process and doesn't set that off. Another idea is actually weekly challenges. Currently, the game's weekly events are a little bit dull, essentially just being flat increases to rewards. I really like the idea, though, of having a really interesting weekly challenge. Well, this time we're going to say to a dungeon, but really you could apply this to anything. It would be a different version of a dungeon that's accessed through a different queue, or something like that. And it would essentially be a version of the dungeon which is totally, pretty different in terms of the actual stuff that goes on inside it. Ideally, it could be a playground for the designers to actually have fun in, similar to how they can create wacky situations in Hearthstone with their Tavern Brawl system. Essentially, there are a lot of things which game designers are not going to do because they know that if they put them in, they've got to really stand the test of time, and they're very permanent, and there's a big risk there when you're adding in something that's permanent. So perhaps having something which could only last for a week and just not be a thing anymore could give some more freedom. Now, I'm not saying create a big new bit of content every week, that's a little bit crazy, but if it's as simple as you have a weekly dungeon which gives players a crazy buff which makes playing the game just absolutely insane. Maybe they give some sort of interesting effect to the encounter, maybe put in 2 of a boss, redesign things. There's a lot that could be done there. They're game designers, they've got 10 times more ideas than they can ever possibly implement, so it could be a fun playground which could just deliver some wacky experiences to players. And because it's a separate thing that's very much its own thing, it wouldn't really have much of an effect on the rest of the game. If this stuff was to make dungeons considerably harder, then perhaps it could be on the pre-made group finder or just be designed for, say, a guild group, where you could really tackle something completely off the wall and different with a bunch of friends, which could be a, I think, very humorous and nice social experience. And speaking of social experiences, well, fixing that up is our next point. World of Warcraft is a social game, but when you're dealing with large groups of people, you're bound to bump into a few twats. That's just how it goes. While this is unavoidable, adding social mechanics to basically load the dice in the favor of players who are kind and helpful is something that should and can be done. I'm pretty sure they try to subtly do this under the hood, but honestly I think a more overt way is maybe a better way of doing things. This has been a massive problem for games like League of Legends and Dota 2. I mean, the levels of toxicity in those games are absolutely insane, and being in the same genre, Heroes of the Storm is actually in a very, very similar position. This is not really something Blizzard have had to deal with in a super effective way, and if they want Heroes to do well, they're absolutely going to have to come up with a solution to this problem. Positive reinforcement for good behavior is a far more effective way of doing things than permabans. Perhaps this would mean giving priority dungeon queues to well-mannered players. I know in many MOBAs you sort of get currency at the end, and you maybe get 5% more currency if you're overall a good and helpful player. What's more important, I think, is that the system would need to be clear to the public so it could permeate the mindset of the community and propagate the idea that being helpful will lead to you having a better and more rewarding time. I know this seems like bribing people to be nice, and I suppose it is, but hell, if it works and it makes the game more enjoyable for people, then by all means, it's likely an improvement. Next up, I think a currency system would be a great addition to the game. I suppose it's not really an addition if it was already a thing, but hey, reintroducing it could be really good. Currency systems provide a catch-up mechanic, unlike, say, Tanan Jungle or the Timeless Isle, where you get your catch-up gear by doing group content that is of a at least semi-relevant challenge. Overall, I think it's a fantastic thing for the game, and it keeps that dungeon content really mattering over the long term. You all know about currency systems, I've talked about them, we can leave it to that video, but essentially, that's really what I think. Also, if you're going to have dungeons be relevant for longer via currency system, and you are also taking steps to make more variety and more interesting things in terms of dungeons, then I think you end up with a long-term dungeon plan that has all the pros of the Wrath system and is also more fun. Crafting materials are actually something that Blizzard have already mentioned, but I think it bears repeating. Having crafting materials drop that are sellable on the auction house provides a nice additional reward for players. It also creates a microeconomy surrounding that item, and the great thing is that that economy that's created leads to more player interaction, and the supply and demand loop that it creates drives more dungeon gameplay. Overall, I think a very good move. One of the biggest mistakes of MoP, in my opinion, for the professions was making those motes of harmony bind on account. I think it's really interesting when you have basically core items used for crafting that come from the world, that come from raids, that come from dungeons, that are then sellable on the auction house. It creates, as I said, a supply and demand where the supply is provided from players actually playing the game on their characters. It means that the regular average Joe can pay for their gameplay and pay for cool items and things like that just by doing the regular content, rather than having to go out and spend like 5 hours mining, which to many people is boring. Overall, just having that in general, but specifically having that for dungeons, would be a very solid move. Next up, I think more difficulty would be good. This is simple, I just think dungeons should be a little bit harder overall. The difficulty which is designed for dungeon finder groups, in my opinion, should have fewer mechanics which actually retain their difficulty. So yeah, there's less stuff going on, but what's still going on still has a decent level of challenge. This way you only have a few things to worry about, but the things you do worry about, you really have to pay attention to them and they still matter, meaning that it's a really, just a better learning experience. Moving up from that, I think the pre-made difficulty level should be harder than the current Mythic dungeons and have more mechanics than their normal mode versions. I actually don't think that today's normal mode actually needs to exist. I would have normal mode be as hard as heroic mode, I would have heroic mode be a little bit harder than Mythic mode, and in terms of leveling dungeons, I would just scale the normal mode. I think that's a really simple way to do things in which there are only 2 versions of dungeons and you don't have too many difficulty levels floating around the place. Maybe Mythic is the sort of thing which they add in halfway through an expansion to give extra life, or maybe they'll just use more dynamic scaling to achieve that effect in the future. But overall, more difficulty, but in a way which really encourages learning and has clear and simple to understand mechanics that just creates better players, because that is for the good of everyone. Anyway, that is essentially it for this video. If I was to really emphasize some points, what I would really like is that weekly or daily quest which actually changes the dungeon and makes it a new and different experience. I would like unique weapons, I would like those essentially just sets that you can work towards, and then I would also really like some story content that's going on, especially since it would come with winged dungeons. Overall, I think they're really some of the core things that Blizzard could do. If you want to go really wacky, sure, weekly dungeons could be a thing, but essentially adding a few rewards, putting in currencies, and doing like 1 or 2 small things which would change up dungeons on a semi-regular basis, I think that would really go a long way to making them matter a lot. And of course, the best way to make dungeons actually matter is to not undercut them with the gear that comes from LFR. Hopefully they have learned enough to actually do that when we get into Legion. Anyway, that's it for this video. I really hope we see dungeons that matter a lot and that give people a great deal of fun. I think that would be a brilliant place for the game to be in. Thank you very much for watching. If you want to talk about this more, hit me up on Twitter, and I will see you next time.